talking, please just pop them in the chat, and Megan will try to answer them, or if it's something that she thinks the group needs to hear, then she will interrupt me and I will address your questions while I'm going through. But do feel free to just pop them in there when they occur to you, rather than waiting until the end, because sometimes it makes more sense to do it as we're going through. We will have a bit of time at the end of the session for questions. We've got 45 minutes today. So if there's any big topics that you want to ask, or very specific questions about your project, then please do hold on to those until the end as well. Okay, so before I start, I just wanted to flag up the website. This is the Library Research Support website for the OU, where you can find loads of content about research data management, including data management plans. And there are a few examples of data management plans on there, as well as links to funder requirements and DMPonline, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And there's also loads of information about all the other things that our team supports. So that's things like open access, bibliometrics, researcher visibility, ORCIDs, all of that good stuff. And then it also has a link to our blog, which is called The Orb, and that has loads of up-to-date information about all of our services, including data management and data management plans. So please, if you haven't had a look at that before, go and have a look at it after this session. And yeah, hopefully you'll find it useful. Sorry, I've just seen a question about microphones. Yeah, the microphones aren't enabled, but if there is something that you'd like to say, please put your hand up and then we can enable your microphone. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? I'm going to explain what a data management plan is and why it's a really good idea to write one. Obviously, we're going to go through what you should include in your data management plan, and I'm going to run through the OU's template for a data management plan. So this is a generic data management plan template, and talk through what you should be putting in each separate section. And then we're going to have a quick look at the DMPonline tool, which, if we have time, I will try to give you a quick demo of. We haven't had time in any of the recent sessions of this, but I've added 15 minutes on, so hopefully we will. And then at the end, we've got questions. But if you have questions in the meantime, then please do put them into the chat. Megan, I can see that somebody's struggling with sound, so could you try and sort that out in the chat for me, please? Okay. So what is a data management plan? Now, funding bodies are increasingly requiring grant holders to develop and implement data management plans as part of their funding bids. But even if you're not asked to write one by your funder, it can be a useful way to address all of the data management issues that you'll encounter during your research project. Data management plans typically state what data will be created and how, and they outline the plans for storage, backup, and sharing and preservation. So storage and backup will be during your project, and sharing and preservation will be when your project ends, typically. And it will note what is appropriate given the nature of the data and any restrictions that may need to be applied. And it's really important to point out now that all research projects are different, and all research data related to those projects is different. So we can't really provide you with a template for a data management plan which will cover every eventuality of how someone's going to conduct their research. And even if we could do that, writing one is good practice because it helps you to think about how you're going to collect, manage and share your data. It's a really useful exercise to go through. So why write one? Your data management plan isn't just for your funder. It should be a useful document just for you, just as I've just explained. You don't have to feel that you're going to stick to everything you put into your plan before you start your research. It's not a static document. It should evolve along with your project. So if things don't quite go to plan, or if things change during your project, then do feel like you can go back to your plan and add things, take things out, change things. Data management is increasingly becoming valued as a key research skill. This is research. This is what you should be doing. Don't think of it as an administrative task. Data management is really important because it ensures that your data is of good quality, that it can be reproduced, and that people can verify your results. And by writing a data management plan before you start collecting your data, you can ensure that that data has the quality that is required. So when do you need to write your data management plan? Now, we advise that you write your data management plan as soon as possible. Quite often you'll be asked to write one while you're submitting a funding bid, but some funders don't require them and some people don't have funded research projects. So even if your funder doesn't require a research data management plan, or if you're not applying for funding, you should still write a data management plan, either when you're planning your research or before you collect your data. And as I mentioned before, definitely try to update it during your work. So if things change, go back to it, think through what you're doing, think about whether the way that you are changing the way you're managing or collecting your data affects the security and the integrity of your data collection. Okay, so on this slide, I've got the logos of some of the funders that require data management plans. Most funders now require them. There have been a few changes recently. So AHRC used to require technical plans, which were all about digital outputs, but now they call them data management plans. Welcome moved from requiring a data management plan to requiring an outputs management plan. So that doesn't just cover data, but also covers original software, materials that you might create like antibodies, cell lines, and reagents. However, the OU recommends that all researchers write a data management plan, regardless of whether their funder requires them to do so or not, because, as I've mentioned already, it's a useful exercise for ensuring that data will be managed responsibly through the life cycle. All these funders have their own templates, which are relevant to their requirements and their focus. So if you are applying for a research grant, then please look for a template and guidance that is specific to your funder. However, these data management plans largely cover the same types of areas. So we're going to look at the generic OU template, which I mentioned before, which covers the common areas that these funders ask for, and which we recommend is used when a funder template hasn't been provided. So hopefully you'll find it useful to go through this generic template to understand what might crop up in other templates, because they are similar, but they've got slightly different requirements. Okay, so here is our generic template. You can use this, you can download it from the link which is on this slide, and we will be sharing these slides at the end of the session. And now I'm going to go through and look at each section and talk about the kind of information that you should put in there. Okay, so the first question is about data collection, and it's important here to be really thorough in your description. Include details of quality assurance. If you're working in a big team, how will you ensure that data collection is consistent? So think about how you're going to set up your interviews or your surveys if you're doing that kind of research. Think about how you're going to set up your spreadsheets if you're collecting quantitative data to ensure that the data that you're collecting is consistent and is properly labelled. Also in this section, it's really important to mention file formats and think about which file formats you're using. When we're writing a data management plan, our ultimate goal is to think about how we will share the data at the end of the project. And so file formats are important to think about because some file formats are better for data sharing, because they're non-proprietary, which means that people don't need a specific type of software to access them, or they're non-proprietary, which is good for preservation, which means that they are less likely to become obsolete in the long term. Also in this section, think about whether you can estimate how much data you're going to collect. For example, if it's audio-visual data, you might be collecting a lot of it, and this may have cost implications on the grant. And most research funders will allow costs for data management within the funding bid, as long as the money is spent before the project is finished. So things like data storage for audio-visual data is an allowable cost for many funders. The next section is documentation and metadata. So what documentation and metadata will accompany the data? Now, metadata is one of those scary words that a lot of people don't really understand, but what it really just means is data about data, or information about your data. So thinking about what other people would need, or what you would need to be able to understand what your research data is. Documentation and metadata make it easier to understand what's what. It's how your data is described to make it understandable to you and others. It's a good idea to assign this information from the very beginning, or you may end up in the situation where you can't understand your own data, let alone anyone else. This documentation might be integral to the file, so it might be something like a heading or a file property, or it might sit alongside your data, like README files, data lists, and lab notebooks. When you're thinking about documentation and metadata, as I mentioned before, think of the end goal of data sharing. So you need to think about what a third party would need to understand your data. And that might be contextual information, an explanation of fields and codes, or methods adapted to collect data. The next section is on ethics and legal compliance. So we do have another webinar that we run, which is on legal and ethical issues in sharing data. And there are recordings available on our training page. And we're also rerunning it later in the autumn. I can't remember the exact date at the moment, but if you have a look at our website training page, you'll be able to see when it's running. And that session looks at ethics and legal compliance in much more detail. But within your data management plan, in this section, you need to include details of how you will obtain consent to collect, use, and share data. So in the past, consent for research projects would mainly be for collecting and using data, but now we also need to think about how you're going to share that data. And in this section, you should detail how you're going to obtain that consent. You also need to think about whether you're going to be anonymizing your data, and if so, how are you going to do this? Will you be using any community standards, or will you be employing an external company? And if you are employing an external company, what confidentiality agreements are going to be in place? And briefly thinking about IP for research data, IP for research data collected or produced by OU employees lies with the institution. Although if you are collaborating with other institutions or with commercial partners, IP will be shared. And in these cases, it's wise to draw up an agreement. If you're using secondary data, you need to make sure that you understand any IP or copyright issues related to using and reproducing this. And the IP team within RES can definitely help you with these aspects if you need help. And the library team can also advise on copyright. So if you've got any questions around legal compliance or around ethics, then feel free to drop me an email and I will either try to answer it myself or pass you on to the relevant team, whether that's the ethics team or the legal people. So, storage and backup. How will the data be stored and backed up during the research? And how will you manage access and security? And again, in this section, it's important to be thorough. The OU recommends storing on OU servers and systems. So these could be network file storage, or they could be tools like OneDrive or SharePoint, which are regularly backed up by IT. But you may also want to back up to an external hard drive to be extra secure. Though be cautious with storing personal sensitive data on external drives, because there is the risk that they get lost or stolen. So be careful about that. In terms of access and security, this becomes more complicated if you are working with collaborators outside the institution, particularly if these collaborators are overseas. You need to consider whether there are any legal issues regarding data transfer overseas. So this might be things like, well, it generally will be data protection, and thinking about whether transferring UK data to other countries or transferring personal data from other countries to the UK is compliant with data protection law, not only in the UK, but also in the country where your collaborators or your participants reside. So have a look at the data protection legislation, and of course contact the university's data protection team for advice, or you can contact me if you're struggling to get through to them, and I'll either help you or I will chase them for you. Also think carefully about who needs access to what. It may be that not everyone on your team needs to access everything. So for example, you could just transfer only anonymized data. That's less risky than transferring personally identifiable data. And by transferring, I generally mean emailing. And when we're emailing things, there's a really, really useful tool that the OU has, which is called Send-To. I'm going to type that into the chat box so you can all see how it's spelled. And this encrypts files when you're sending them. So it's much more secure than sending things via email. And it also means that you can send large files without having to upload them to your email. So it's a lot quicker and easier, and it doesn't bung up people's email inboxes, because it's a bit like Dropbox. You drop something off in one place and then someone comes and collects it with a password. Okay, I'm going to move on to selection and preservation now. So we're thinking here about plans for research while you've completed your research. So which data should be retained, shared and or preserved, and what is the long-term preservation plan for the data set. Now, in terms of which data should be retained, shared and or preserved, not everything needs to be kept, although in some cases you might want to keep everything. But generally, you will want to go through a selection process to decide which things you can keep and which things you will destroy. So for example, if your audio recordings have been transcribed and anonymized, then do you need to keep the recordings? Likewise, you may only want to put a subset of your data into a repository. This is particularly relevant if you have a lot of data, which would take a long time to prepare and upload, or if some of your data might be inappropriate for sharing with the public, either for ethical reasons or for legal reasons, but a small subset of that data can be shared and would still be useful to share. Most funders and the OU require you to preserve your research data from your research project for a minimum of 10 years after the project ends. And you need to think about how you'll do this. And in terms of preservation, by putting your data into a data repository, and by assigning metadata, and by converting it into a non-proprietary format, you are going a lot of the way towards ensuring that your data will be preserved for 10 years.
Isabel, can I just ask you a question? Hi.
Hello.
Alison's asked, where can we learn about
Hello.
how to attach metadata to files?
Okay, so we do have some guidance on our website. So it depends how you're going to do it. So if you're talking about embedded metadata, so that's things like headings in your files or putting things into the properties, then I don't think we've got any advice on our website at the moment, but if you email me, I'll send some over to you. A really good place to look for that is also the UK Data Service. They've got really good advice on metadata and documentation. In terms of a README file that you would attach to your files, so that people could understand at a project level what's going on with your files, then we have a template on our website, which you are very welcome to use. And I don't know whether Megan might be able to find the URL for that part of the website. It's one that's called something like describing your data. Megan, if you could add that to the chat, that'd be useful.
Yeah, I'll have a look. Thank you.
Was there another question?
There's
Sorry.
also one asking why the OU doesn't support Dropbox when other universities do for joint projects between different institutions.
Okay, this is to do with information security, and it's a decision that they've made. I think we need to admit that probably some people are still using Dropbox in the institution. I would say definitely do not use it for personal data, because we cannot guarantee that Dropbox won't have a failure, that it might go out of business. And I think that sometimes the data might be kept outside of the EU, which is not compliant with GDPR. But information security do say don't use it at all. And so that's the line that I've been told to give here. Okay, I'm just going to look to see what the... Yeah, of course.
And then one more. Can I go for one more? Oh. Leo says he's noticed that he's seen some mentions of archiving the data in Ordo and also in the UK.
Okay, that's a really good question. So the UK Data Service is funded by the ESRC. So if you have ESRC funding, then you should be offering your data to the UK Data Service. And that takes priority over putting it into Ordo. Also, if your data is in line with the collection policy of the UK Data Service, so they collect economic and social sciences data. If that's the type of data that you have, you can also offer it to the UK Data Service. And in general, I would say that it's a better place to put that kind of data because it's a well-known repository that is subject specific, and your data will be more discoverable to other people in your field because they already know it's there, and it's a real seal of approval for your discipline to put it in there. Now, if you are not ESRC funded and your data is not within the collection policy of the UK Data Service or any other external repository, so for example, there are several NERC data centres for people who are working with environmental science, then putting your data into Ordo is absolutely brilliant too, because you will get a DOI for your data sets. It will be discoverable by Google, and it's a good place to put it because we will preserve your data for 10 years in the format that you've added it to Ordo in. Do not put your data into two repositories. First of all, it's a waste of your own time because putting it into one place is absolutely fine, and it takes quite a long time to upload data to repositories generally. Also, if you upload it to two places, you will end up with two DOIs, which can be really confusing when you're popping it into your papers or popping it into your conference proceedings. And it's confusing for people who are trying to find your data as well, to know which one is the most up-to-date best copy. And if you need to make changes to it, having it in two places is also confusing. So in summary, the best place to put it is in a funder or subject-specific repository. But if you do not have a funder or subject-specific repository, then putting in Ordo is fine. Okay, I hope that's clear.
Yeah, that's helpful,
Okay.
Isabel.
Is there
Thank
any
you.
other questions? Okay. Right. Had I finished on this? But I think I had. Okay, so on to data sharing. So how will you share the data, and are there any restrictions on data sharing required? So when we talk about data sharing, this is post-project, and it's sharing it publicly so that people can reuse or evaluate your data to verify your results. There is an expectation and sometimes requirement that research data is shared. And this is normally to support publications and at the end of a project, although in some cases you might share your data during your project. And there are some projects at the OU that are doing this. Maybe it's a longitudinal study and it's interesting to publish those data throughout the project. Or it might be that you're working with the public heavily and you want to be able to share those data with them before the project ends. So the best way to share your data is to use a dedicated research data repository. And I've just mentioned this to you, so I'm not going to go through it again. But first choice is funder or subject specific, second choice is order. Okay. This putting your data into a research data repository will help you to ensure discoverability. So by that I mean that it will be findable via web searching tools, and it will also enable you to assign access restrictions to part of your data set. So it might be that some parts of your data set can be made publicly available, but it might be that only certain people can access other parts of your data set. And usually, I can't see my slides anymore. Megan, what have you done? Is this you, Megan? Oh, yeah. And usually, you will be able to assign different levels to different parts of your
Sorry,
data
Isabel, I
set.
don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to get out of this
It's all
full
right.
screen.
I've made it worse. Sorry, guys, just bear with us a minute. I don't know what Megan's
I
done
don't know
here.
how to get out of it.
Okay, there we go.
Is that better?
Oh no, that's too much, isn't it?
Is that better? Sorry,
There we
Isabel.
go. That's
Sorry,
better.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you. No, sorry about that. So you might want to assign different access restrictions to different parts of your data set, and putting it into a data repository will usually support you to be able to do that. You might have to embargo your data, so include that in your data sharing. So you might want to embargo it because you are seeking a patent, or because you want to release your publication before your data becomes available, and you can do that as well. Include details of whether you do that in your plan. Are there any other restrictions on data sharing? Is there a risk that you won't be able to share your data because your participants won't agree to it? Is it impossible for you to anonymize your data effectively, so that participants can't be identified from it? In those cases, just include the reasons why you can't share your data at all in your plan, and explain that you've thought through it and that these restrictions absolutely can't be overcome, and that's absolutely fine. The mantra here is to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So there is an awareness from funders and from the institution that you can't always share all of your data, but try to share as much of it as you can and think through the possibilities of whether you can do it at all. I see there's quite a detailed question in the chat, so I'm just going to have a quick look at that before I move on. Oh, this is quite a technical question. I meant to address that one at the end, okay? All right, so in terms of responsibilities and resources, in this section, you've got to think about who's going to be responsible for data management plan. And a lot of people, when they fill in this section of a data management plan, say that the PI has overall responsibility. But I think in a lot of cases, if you're working on a large research project with a lot of people, expecting one person, and especially the PI, to be responsible for all the data management processes is unrealistic. So really what you should be thinking about is how everyone's going to pitch in to be able to ensure that the data is being stored securely and that the quality of the data is being maintained by assigning the proper metadata and by making sure that it's in the correct format and with the correct file naming system and all of that lovely stuff that means that the data is still useful throughout the project and beyond. And in terms of resources that you'll require to deliver your plan, this for many funders is an allowable cost. So you might need to allow costs for things like external contractors. These might be transcribers or translators. And in some cases, you might want to store your data in a system which has costs associated with it. So thinking about that kind of thing at this point will both allow you to have costs and also allow you to think about what everyone in the team is responsible for doing to ensure that the data is being kept securely and managed properly. So here are my top tips for writing a successful data management plan. Keep it simple, short and specific. So not all the reviewers or readers of your data management plan are going to be data management experts. Be specific. Instead of saying we will follow standards, explain which standards. And instead of saying we will create a large amount of data, think about how much data. And I know at this point you probably can't be completely specific on that, but give us a ballpark, because a large amount of data could be 100 gigabytes, it could be a terabyte, it could be 10 terabytes. A large amount of data doesn't mean anything. And keeping it short, so some funders have requirements for how long the plan should be. So for example, some are limited to 1 or 2 sides of A4 at a certain font size. So you really do need to be concise. The details of your project should be included in your case for support. So you really just need to go into the technical aspects of how you're going to manage your data in this document. Definitely seek advice. So you can seek advice from other researchers at the university who have written data management plans for the same funder, or who've done similar projects with similar types of data. So we've got an example here. The researchers who are working on the listening experience database took advice from the colleagues who had worked on the reading experience database to write their data management plan. And actually they could just carry over a lot of the things that the reading experience database people had put into their plan and put it into their ones. We are lucky because we've got a team of data champions at the Open University who are really keen to help you. So if you're struggling to find anyone who can help you with your data management plan in your area and you want to talk to another researcher about it, then please feel free to get in contact with me and I will assign you one of our data champions who'll be able to help you as well. And obviously, please get in touch with me if you're struggling, because I'm here to help you with this. For a lot of people, it might be the first time that you're writing a data management plan and it can feel quite overwhelming, not knowing what you're supposed to be including in there. So please do get in touch with me. Be realistic. Is what you've planned in your data management plan, is it achievable? Are you trying to do too much? Research data management is an allowable cost for a lot of funders, including UKRI funders, but any costs that you include attributed to data management have to be fully accounted for and have to be spent before the end of the project.
Isabel?
Okay.
Oh, I was wondering if
Yeah.
Leo's asked if they can use the OneDrive, the OU OneDrive for storing and sharing the live data with collaborators before archiving.
Yeah, and that's something we do recommend you do, using OneDrive, because OU IT security have designated OneDrive as being suitable for confidential data. And it's really good for sharing with collaborators because you don't need to have an OU username like you would do to be able to access networked file storage. You only need a Microsoft username and password to be able to access anything in OneDrive. So it's a really good way of sharing your data with people outside of the institution. If you've got any personal data in there, I would recommend that you password protect it before you pop it in. Just so that it doesn't accidentally get in the wrong hands. But in general, OneDrive is a good solution. There's a question about contact information. We can put that will be on the last slide of this presentation, but we'll also share it. Oh, I was told OneDrive was not secure enough. IT security have told us that it's fine to use it. SharePoint is also a good option, but SharePoint for some people is quite hard to use because it doesn't have the same folder structure that OneDrive has. But I will check that with OU IT security because they definitely have told me that OneDrive is fine to use. That's interesting. Who was it who told you that, out of interest? I'm going to give you time to answer that question. I'll move on to DMPonline. Okay, so DMPonline, I've mentioned it briefly before. This is a system that's been set up by the DCC, which is the Digital Curation Centre, and they're the UK experts for research data management. It's a really useful tool. It gives you different templates for different research funders, and you can set up your own account for free. Go in, click on the funder that you're writing a plan for, and it will give you the template. And alongside the template, we will have prompts that will tell you what is expected from the funder and from the OU when you fill in that section. Lots of people find this really useful. And another really good thing about it is that once you've written your plan, there is an option to share it. So you can use the share button to either share it with me or to share it with your collaborators or both. And we can have a look at it and give you feedback on it directly in the system. And then there's a download option, which will ensure that your data management plan fits within the prescribed page numbers that many funders have. So it's a really useful tool. I don't think that I've got time to demo it today, but if you have a look at it and you're struggling with how to use it, then please do send us an email and we'll try to resolve those problems for you. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I'm happy to review data management plans, but please try to give me as much notice as possible. A week is ideal because some of them do take quite a long time for me to review, and demand for this has been quite high lately. So it's been taking slightly longer than it might have done in the past if you've ever sent me one before.
Isabel, DMPonline can be used if the researcher hasn't got any funders as well, can't it?
That's correct, and our OU template is on there, so you definitely can use it if you don't have a funder. But you can also download the template from our website. Did we get an answer to who said that OneDrive wasn't, information security said that it wasn't secure enough? Right, I'm going to check up on that. But as far as I'm concerned, it's fine. So, but I will, if it's not fine, I will email everyone in this training session and say don't use OneDrive, but I'm pretty sure it's okay. And I agree, they're both Microsoft Cloud, so I don't see what the difference is between SharePoint and OneDrive. Okay, so here are some links to some useful resources. So we've got the website, which I spoke about before, DMPonline, which I've spoken about, and the Digital Curation Centre that I've spoken about, and the UK Data Service, which I've spoken about. And then we've got a few more useful ones. So there's the Sesta ERIC training. This is a training course that I think is really useful if you're just starting out on data management. It is for social sciences, but I think that if you're working with qualitative data, it's really, really useful. And then we've got the Ethics Committee, Data Protection and Information Security, who are all really helpful people for different aspects of data management. So please do feel free to get in touch with them if there's anything that you're struggling with. We've got time for questions, but I'm not going to leave it on this slide because I want you to see our feedback form. This is the link to our feedback form, so please do go on there and let us know one thing you liked about today's session and one thing you would change. That's really helpful for helping us to change and improve our training offering in the future. So I'm just going to stick around for 5 minutes in case anyone has any questions. For the data champions, we don't have an email address for them, but if you email me, I can pass on any inquiries to the team. Or rather than email me, email the inbox, which is this. I'm putting it in. And if you go onto our website, there is a Data Champions page, so you can have a look at who all of our different data champions are and identify if there's anyone you want to approach personally. Yeah, that's fine. Megan has put the link to the feedback form into the chat, so I'll go back to the list of resources for you. Yeah, I will email out a copy of the slides and the recording later on today, so have a look out for that. Yes, the slides will have active URL links. Thanks, everyone. I hope it's not too mind-boggling. Just get in touch if you're struggling.